what we'll do now is we'll begin the presentation. Thanks everybody for letting us know what's brought you here today. What we're going to do is just have a look, first of all, at a bit of science, and then we're going to look at the various stages of awakening, and maybe you can follow along and see which stage do you think you're actually at and what you can do to move between the stage you're at and the neighbouring stages that are available to you. I'm just going to start the presentation here. Okay, so I just want to share something from my background. My first degree, I went to study astrophysics at Queen Mary College in the University of London, and I had a really strong fascination for the cosmos, for the universe. I was a bit of a Luke Skywalker character, and I wanted to be an astronaut and run around the galaxy and do amazing things with the Force. And the first port of call for me was to understand the science behind how the universe works before I went on to explore the more spiritual side of how reality functions. One of the first things I learned, even before I went to university, was that scientists, when they look out at the universe, their material instruments can only detect about 1% of what's really out there. Now, if they can only detect 1% of what's out there, and what I'm talking about here is matter, visible matter, that stuff that they can see, the stuff that they can measure, it only accounts for 1% of what there is. There's a whole bunch of other stuff which can't be detected with scientific instruments or through our senses, and it actually makes up the majority of the universe. So science can really only account for 1% of the universe and what it's made of using the scientific instruments and the senses that we've actually got as human beings. So the rest of it, the other 99% of it, is not directly accessible by scientific instruments, by telescopes, microscopes, or particle accelerators, whatever it is that science uses to measure and explore the universe. It's just not accessible to science simply because it seems to be made up of stuff which is not like the matter that we are familiar with, the hard, tangible stuff, or the stuff that makes up material instruments. Now, what it also means is that when you look at yourself in the mirror in the morning, you are actually looking, that physical part of you that you see as a reflection in the mirror, that physical part of you that you're seeing, that's just 1% of you, of who you are as a being, as a physical being. There's another 100 times that amount of substance around you and within you that you can't see, but it's there. And this is just an extension of what we know about the universe, that everything that's visible only accounts for 1% of what is making up things. The other 99% is not visible to us or detectable, but it's there. It's kind of overlays what's there. So it seems that if that's the case, if that's a basic fact in science, then it means that what we're aware of kind of follows the same kind of rule. Our typical human awareness of what's going on in our lives, what we observe in our lives and around us in the world, and what we're truly capable of being aware of, they have a kind of similar set of statistics to describe them, to what matter there is that's visible in the universe and is detectable, and what's invisible and is there, but we can't seem to connect into it using material instruments. We could connect into those things, of course, using other instruments which are not material, but that's a subject for another conversation where we look at consciousness and how it can be an instrument to detect that other 99% of the universe. So if we look at our awareness that we work with on a daily basis, when we wake up in the morning and we go to work and we have breakfast and we see our friends, typically the consciousness that we have access to is 1% of what there is. Now, this isn't the same as what some people say, where they talk about the brain and say you're only using 10% of your brain's full potential and 90% if it isn't actually being used. It's not about that. This is actually saying that when you're wandering around your home or around the town that you're living in or the world, what you observe, what you can experience is typically only 1% of what you can fully experience. 99% of what you can experience from yourself, from your relationships, from the world, from the dimensions that you're actually in, is not accessible to you. Most of this is down to the fact that you're just not tuned in. You have instrumentation in your consciousness and your awareness to tune into that other 99%, but that instrumentation is just not switched on, or it's just not functioning for some reason. Maybe you're just focusing on filtering out just the 1% that you have the capacity to handle on a day-by-day basis. If you were to be exposed to the other 99%, it might be incredibly overwhelming. So it takes a little bit of conditioning and a little bit of priming in order to handle a bigger view of the universe, or even a bigger view of your own life and your own capacity. And what this presentation today is about where are you between that 1% and that 100% awareness of yourself and the world. Now, in psychology and in personal development and coaching, there's something called Johari's window, which helps us get a better picture of what I mean here about being awake and being aware to what's going on for yourself and what's going on in the world. Johari is a shortened version of the two names associated with the people who create Johari's window, and that's Joseph Luft and Harrington Ingham. And they created that in the 1920s in the United States. And they did it to help people better understand their relationship with themselves and with other people. It consists of 4 areas. The first area is to do with what you are aware of, what you're conscious of about yourself. And it's also the part of yourself that other people see, that between you can agree that there's something there that's true for both of you. So if you look at yourself, there's probably parts of yourself that you know really well, and those same parts are known to other people. Other people recognize those things in you. There are parts of you that are associated with what's known as the public self. And it's information that everybody knows. So this is the top left corner of Johari's window. It's known by yourself, known by the character that's you, but it's also known by other characters and other people who are kind of trying to read who you are as a person. There's another part of you which you don't know about, which you're blind to, but other people nevertheless can see. And that part is the part that's on the top right, the blind self. It's not known by you as a character, but it is known by other people. And it's information that you don't know, or you're not acknowledging about who you are or what you're doing in life. Maybe even it's something you're in denial about, but other characters in your life and other people who are trying to understand you and relate with you, they do know, they do observe it. So that represents the part of your awareness which is known as the blind self. Now, there's another part which is also known by you, but it's private to you. It's not known by other people. It's known as the private self, and it's the bottom left corner of Johari's window. It's known by you as a character, but not known by other people and other people who are looking at relating to you. It's private information, known only to you, and other people can only guess what might be going on with you in this area of your life, or this area of your behavior, your character, or your personality. They can only make an inferral, if you like, from what they've observed. The fourth and last area is the unknown self. This is the area that you don't know anything about yourself, that you're blind to yourself, and it's also an area about your behavior that other people can't even see or recognize. They don't see it either. But it's nevertheless there. It's just something you're blind to and other people are blind to. For some reason, neither of you pick up on what's going on in that part of your behavior or part of yourself or your awareness. So it's information that no one knows. The person who's looking at you or relating to you can make guesses about what those aspects of your personality might be, and you'll probably find that if someone did point this out to you, that you'll be in total denial of that part of yourself, and you'll be completely unaware of that part of yourself. Now, this isn't necessarily an area that's bad. It could be an area that's positive. It's a form of hidden potential, but you can't see it, and nobody else gets you either in terms of how amazing you are in that part of yourself. So that's Johari's window. Now, awakening is ultimately about moving as far away as you can from the bottom right of the window, where everything's unknown to you and also unknown to others, and trying to get to the top left corner, where everything is known to you. You're fully aware of everything that's going on inside of you and around you, and also other people are. Now, you might think, well, there's some parts of myself I don't want other people to see. I don't want those to be revealed to other people. If that's the case, and you're hanging out in the bottom left territory where you are being a private self, if you will, if you're really someone who has strength in your character and you're congruent and you have the courage to be authentic, then it shouldn't be a problem for you to have who you really are on show to the rest of the world. So ideally what you want to do is you want to get to that position where you are strong enough and courageous enough to be authentic and fully be aware of everything that's going on inside of you, and also allow that to be seen by other people. So that ideal state of awakening is where you are someone who's having awareness of what's authentic in you, and you are not just aware of it, but you're being that. You're kind of walking your talk in that respect. But you're also doing the same thing with other people. You have awareness of what's authentic in other people, and you only want to work with that part of them. You don't want to work with any part which is inauthentic or parts of other people's behaviours where they're engaged for some reason or other. So it's important that you always act in a way where you have full awareness of what's authentic in you and in others, and you choose only to work with that. All right, I'm just going to stop there for a moment, and before I go on to the next stage, is just check in with people and just get some feedback about what they've actually made of what I've said so far. So I'm just going to check in with some other people that I've not checked into already. Let's check in with Hazel Oti. Hey, Hazel. Can you hear me? No? Let's try Deborah. Deborah. Magdalene. Can you hear me?
I can, Jazz, yes.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining us today. What have you made so far of what I've said?
I've only just this minute joined you. I've just logged on.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'm going to do then is I might just have a chat with somebody else and come back to you a little bit later. Elena Lascava. Can you hear us, Elena?
Yeah. Hi, Jeff. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead.
Oh, great. Thank you. Well, I'm really happy I can be here. I'm just trying to absorb all the information which I can hear.
Right.
And at the moment, I don't really see myself in any of the squares. Maybe I'm blind to myself totally. I don't know where I am actually.
Okay, well, this is a Western model of awareness and consciousness. What I'm going to show you in a moment is a bit more of an expanded version of this, a bit more of a practical version of this that I've experienced with all the people that I've been working with over the last 5 or 6 years. So maybe that'll be something there that actually resonates more closely with you, because from here it's difficult to get real-world examples. All right, Elena, thanks very much. We'll might come back to you a little bit later. We'll just take one more comment, perhaps from Marsha. What? Why don't we hear from you, Marsha? Can you hear us, Marsha? No? Okay, let's try Mariela instead. Mariela?
Yeah. Hold on.
What have you made so far of what was being discussed?
Sorry, I only just got on because I couldn't download the application.
What have you made so far of what's been said?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
I only just got onto your webinar, so I'm a little bit late, so I don't know what you have said.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll come back to you another time. I think what we'll do, just for the time being, move along to the next part of the presentation, and we'll get some more feedback in a moment. Okay. So just to summarize, the highest kind of awakening is where you have awareness, full awareness of what's authentic within you, what's really true about you, and that you're courageous enough to actually honor that and act on that in the world. But also you're doing the same thing with other people. You're working with what's authentic within them and working with their awareness of what's authentic within them. You're not working with ignorance. You're not working with inauthenticity or lack of congruence or integrity. Those are things that tend to move you away from the top left corner and move you towards the bottom right or into one of the other cells in the window. So this, as I said, is very much an old model of how conscious a person actually is of their circumstances in life, at work, or even in the world. I'm going to present something which is slightly a kind of evolution of this in the remaining slides today. Okay, so what we're going to have a look at instead is something I call the 7 states of awakening. I don't call it the 7 levels of awakening because it's often found that when people are in a particular state, they will move into a different state. And in conventional terms, it might look like moving to a lower level of consciousness, less awareness. But you'll see later on that actually sometimes it's important to move to another level of consciousness, another level of awareness, which might be considered to be lower than the one you're actually in. So in that sense, it's not really lower, it's just something that's become more significant for the time that you're actually in. So in reality, there aren't really different levels of awakening. There's just different levels of, I suppose, significance for the kind of consciousness that you're in. And at different times, they have different values. So, for example, if you just look at how you function on a normal basis every day, you wake up in the morning, you might go to work, but if you were to stay awake day after day and not take any rest, then eventually it would start to affect your awareness, your judgment, even your health. You would have to take some kind of rest or recuperation where you go and get some quality sleep. And it's necessary in order for you to continue being able to function effectively the next day as far as your consciousness awareness is concerned. So it makes sense sometimes to move yourself to a lower level of consciousness. And in reality, it's not really a lower level. It's a more useful level. So I don't really like to use the term level or height of consciousness. I prefer to use words like states or spaces because you tend to move around between them, and sometimes something that in conventional senses might appear to be a lower state of awakening and consciousness is actually more important, it's more significant. So you'll see me use that language a lot. I'm often someone who refers to space a lot because my first degree is in astrophysics. And if you're in space, like on the International Space Station, for example, where there is no gravity, then there is no such thing as an absolute up or down. It's completely relative. And I think in reality, when you move out of the dimensions that we normally inhabit with our awareness, you'll find something similar. There is no high or low or up or down or wrong or right even. It's all relative, and it just depends on your circumstances and your own perspective and your own consciousness that you have available to you, how things are actually experienced. Okay, so let's have a look at the 7 states of awakening. The deepest state of awakening where your awareness of the world is minimized and you have very little idea about what's going on in your life or in the world is what I call the sedated level. This is literally like when someone is at hospital and they're experiencing trauma or suffering and they have to be sedated in order for them to not experience suffering. And that you typically see them attached to a lot of devices, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. Now, the stage that is a little bit more active and a bit more accessible and a bit more influenceable by a person's intent and consciousness is sleeping. Now, someone who's sedated, even if you shook them, it's unlikely that they would wake up. However, someone who's asleep or sleeping, if you pushed them or touched them or maybe shouted at them, then they might suddenly wake up. And they're also able to wake up of their own conscious intent. That's another feature of someone who's asleep compared to someone who's sedated. Now, metaphorically, this all has relevance for our consciousness and our awareness, which I'll talk more about when I go into each of these stages in a moment. The next step up from sleeping is sleepwalking. From a distance, someone who's sleepwalking looks like they're awake. They look like they're doing things that someone who's awake would do. They might be making a cup of tea, they might be reading a book, they might be walking, literally. But on closer examination, if you went up to them and started having a conversation with them, for example, you would find that they're in their own little world, and they don't really have a dialogue with you. So it only appears like they're awake, but in reality they're not. They're just in some kind of automated kind of mode, if you will. Now, there is a slightly higher level of consciousness in sleepwalking, which is sleepwaking. This is where someone has moments of genuine awakening, where they really do see things as they are, but they can't seem to sustain that level of awareness for very long. It's just a glimpse. It's almost random in some instances, but it's possible for them to see enough that when they return to their normal level of daily consciousness, they have a memory of what they saw, and they have a sense of what the truth is about themselves and the world, but they don't really have full access to it when they return to their normal state of consciousness. There does come a stage where a person does fully wake up to what's going on for themselves in the world, and in this state there's something unusual that happens, which is that when someone really does wake up, that a major shift in their consciousness that happens is they can actually see other people who are awake, and in addition they can see other people who are still asleep and maybe sleepwalking or even sleepwaking. And you know, if they were to push certain people and they wouldn't respond, they would even be able to recognize the people who are sedated, people who are just hopelessly buried at a level of consciousness where they just can't be reached or can't be woken up. So someone who's awakened can actually spot other people who are awake, but they can also spot other people who are asleep or in lower levels of traditional consciousness. Now, just because someone's awake, it doesn't mean that they're active. For example, someone can be awake and they could be still in their bed, and they could talk to someone who's sitting in a chair next to the bed and have a dialogue with them, but they're not actually up and around and moving. It may be that they need help from other people because they're bedridden, psychologically speaking. So there does come a stage where they are able to get up, metaphorically speaking, out of their bed, and they can get around, move around on their own, look after themselves. And that's what is known as the activated state of awakening. Also, it means this is where they can start to cooperate with other people and look after their own survival, as well as help other people around them to look after themselves too. The final stage is where the person's not just awake to themselves and their own needs, but they're awake to other people's needs beyond their immediate family or beyond the space that they actually live in their everyday life. If you compare it to a house, it's like knowing everybody in your house and being able to liaise and cooperate with them to look after that house. But the next stage outside of that would be to go out into the street and know your neighbours, know your community, and maybe even find a place for yourself in that community in terms of work or some kind of purpose that will lead to you making a difference beyond yourself in the world, while also at the same time doing something to be able to look after yourself. So the highest state of awakening is where you can get to that stage where you can empower yourself and you can also empower others through some common good that you all work on together in a community of awakened people. Okay, so those are the 7 stages or states of awakening. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through each of those states and just talk about some of their features and what happens when someone moves from one stage to the next, or when sometimes people actually reverse and go backwards through these steps, and sometimes why that's actually necessary and why it's actually important for that to be done. In the example I gave earlier, I said that you can't be awake all the time. Sometimes you have to rest, you have to recuperate, so that you can come back to being awake more fully. So that's an example of when you might need to go backwards rather than forwards in terms of your awakening. Okay, so as I said, I'll move into each of those stages in a moment. I'm going to just go back again to members of the audience that are listening and just ask what they've made so far of what they've heard. I'll go back to you, Deborah. What have you made so far of these states of awakening that I've mentioned?
Yeah, I can recognise all those states. One thing I don't get is why you can't be awakened all the time. Maybe because I missed the beginning of it.
Yeah, I did mention that it's like if you look at your ordinary life, if you were awake all the time and you never went and had any sleep, and you did day after day you were awake, eventually that would affect your health, and that would affect your consciousness and your awareness and your ability to perceive things accurately. And it's kind of like hibernation. Sometimes, you need to go into hibernation or incubation in order to transform or recuperate so that you can then operate a higher level of being. That's what that's about. Does that make sense?
It does, but how long would you need to do that for, Joe?
Well, it depends on the kind of state that you're about to move into. For example, a caterpillar, when it goes into a chrysalis stage, it has to stay in there long enough for its internal organs to rearrange themselves into the functions that are going to be needed for it to become a butterfly. And it's the same thing with people. Sometimes they need to go into hibernation or kind of incubation. It can even come across as someone being depressed when actually they're not. They're just going into a deep state of rest, as a kind of a play on words that some people have actually used. Being depressed is actually about being in a deep state of rest, or there being a call to be in a deep state of rest so that you can recuperate and gather enough energy to leap up into a higher state.
Yeah, because I mean sometimes we need to just take time out and step back and rest and like withdraw from groups and things like that. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, exactly. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's necessary in order for you to marshal together enough energy in order for you to move on to the next stage of what you're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot, Deborah. What I'll do is I'll just have a chat with one more person, and we'll move on to looking at each of these stages in a bit more detail. Let's go back to Hazel. Hazel, have you got something to say about what you've heard so far?
Hello, I've got my sound back. Hello.
Good, great.
Yeah, yeah, it all makes sense. Sorry, what's that?
Yeah.
It all makes sense, and I think also once somebody, it's like if you've never eaten a steak, you don't know what the steak tastes like. But once you've eaten it, you can't ever forget it. Forget that you've eaten the steak. But you might, not really have one again, or, So I don't think if you sort of come to a much more awakened state of awareness, you forget it. But sometimes you just don't. You can't always be living in full, well, like you say, full awakeness all the time, because we need to recoup, we need to process things, and I think, as you were saying, there are the spaces we're constantly moving between states all the time. So it's not about always being turned on like a sort of really strong light bulb. I think it's a fluctuating thing like everything else in the universe. I don't think we're just in one zone or another zone, which is the point about the levels. So I think whereas if somebody's what we would call sedated or sleeping, they don't have that experience of awakeness in the way that people will have done, so it'll be much quicker perhaps to come back to it, or the awareness is still there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we'll talk about in a moment, where we look at examples of people who have awakened, and they, through conscious intent of their own, if they do go back to sleep, they can always wake themselves up. But the difference between someone like that and someone who's never woken up is they might not necessarily be able to wake up by themselves. They might need to have some kind of external stimulus coming along to bring them out of that state of consciousness into
Like a
another
large
one.
hot rod.
Yes, or someone shaking them or giving them a profound truth or an awakening or an epiphany. There could be a whole bunch of things. Sometimes it comes through a painful experience, and if you punch someone while they're asleep and they experience pain, that they're going to wake up and they might do something in return. But the point is that they would need an external stimulus to wake them up. But one of the things I've highlighted here is that, for example, if someone's sedated, you can shake them all you like. You can even punch them or give them pain, and you might find that they just won't wake up. And there's a lot of people in the world who are like this, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, where we look at people who are in a state of sedation and what are the symptoms of someone who's in a state of sedation. So thanks very much, Hazel, for your comments there. What we'll do now, I think, is move on to looking at each of these stages of awakening and what their signs and symptoms are and how it is that you can move between them. Okay, so if we look at the state of being sedated, if we literally look at it in a literal way, like how someone is sedated in hospital, you can actually see that metaphorically there's a lot of very similar kind of appearances to individuals whose consciousness is sedated. They're alive, they're moving through the world, but somehow they don't seem to be connected into the same world as the rest of us. One of the classic things you'll discover is that the person who's sedated is typically trying to, as much as possible, to numb themselves to reality, or they're trying to do something which makes them feel more comfortable, but in the process distorts their awareness. And there are typical signs and symptoms of people who are sedated. So as an example, you're going to find people who are on drugs, for example, they are taking those drugs, whether it's alcohol, cigarettes, or other drugs like cocaine or heroin. They're taking those drugs because they want to feel better and not feel pain or not have to face certain things. Even when it's supposedly recreational, and people say, I'm doing this in order to relax, it's something that they're relying on that's external and it's not internal. So they're not really trying to engage with their awareness more strongly. They're often trying to escape from their current state of awareness. Although there are certain drugs, of course, like LSD and maybe cannabis and DMT, which comes from ayahuasca, which actually expands your awareness. And there are even practices like yoga or meditation or Tai Chi and Qigong, which can actually shift your awareness. But what we're talking about here is a lesser connection to reality rather than a greater connection to reality. So typically these people are trying to avoid being aware of things in reality. So they'll take drugs to do that. They'll typically attach themselves to devices. They'll connect themselves to their smartphones, their laptops, their tablets, their newspapers, their magazines, anything which is a device which takes that person away from a direct experience of reality. That's what I mean here by a device. It's designed to actually cushion them from reality, the world. This also includes distractions. They do things to perhaps entertain themselves, but not in a way where they're going to recuperate or regenerate energy, but they're doing it because they don't want to face up to what they've really got to deal with. And they just want to avert their gaze. And that's what I mean by distractions. Sometimes these factors can mix together, like, for example, drugs and distraction. If you bring them together, then if that gets to be something that is a frequent behavior, then it can eventually become an addiction, and it can remove that person from reality and put them into a completely false state of reality. And that is, of course, a big problem in modern society, simply because of the fact that it's taking people away from the potential that they have within themselves, and it's removing them into a space where they can't actually evolve or wake up or empower themselves. They're actually disempowering themselves as a consequence of increased usage of each of these things or combinations of these things. There are some typical features of people who are sedated, one of them being it's almost like they're in a state of anesthesia, you know. No matter what you do to wake up someone to certain facts or a certain reality or even alternate possibilities, where you're trying to get them to look at reality and say, look, there's alternate ways of looking at this, and not necessarily to treat reality as it is, but to see that there are other possibilities beyond what's being presented. Some people are just totally blind, and they are anesthetized to any other reality other than the one that they're kind of programmed with. Dogmatic scientists typically fall into this category. They see the world in a particular way, and if something comes along in their experience, their evidence that doesn't fit with their models, they will banish it. They'll almost call it blasphemy, you know, in some kind of way. So anesthesia, a refusal to connect directly with experience, and a choice to numb yourself or blind yourself or exclude reality because it doesn't fit with the way that you are conditioned to believe. That's another example of being sedated. There are some other symptoms. Typically people, you know, as I said, with addictions and distractions or drugs, they'll tend to focus more on what they want rather than what they genuinely need. And this means that they'll also tend to focus on getting power and increasing their ability to influence things and change things, but they do it in a way which isn't respectful or responsible, which means they're seeking increased power, and other people have got to be in some way lower than themselves in terms of their ability to influence. And this means that they end up really focusing on wanting power more than being empowered or empowering others. So this is another characteristic of someone who's sedated. They're hungry for what they want, but they neglect what they need. They're hungry for power, but they neglect empowering themselves or others. And you also find that they will tend to focus on what they like rather than what they could learn. So a lot of people on Facebook, for example, they go around clicking things that they like, but I think in a lot of instances they're also clicking because they've learnt something too, but unfortunately there's no feature for that in Facebook. But you'll tend to find that the people who choose to connect into things because they like them, they have a preference for them, rather than it being a genuine priority or something they can learn from that empowers them, these are examples of people, again, who are sedated more than they are kind of awake. You also find that these individuals, like a person who is sedated at a hospital, they will not be able to wake up on their own, under their own volition or with their own free will. It's only ever going to be able to be done through some kind of external help, or if any of the things that are putting them into that state of sedation are removed in a gentle, graceful way, so they don't end up in some kind of shock as a consequence of being removed from those dependencies too quickly. So if the drugs are taken away, if the devices that distract them or lead them into states of addiction or anesthetize them in terms of the perspectives that they're actually holding, if each of these things is gracefully removed, then probably what you find is that person moves into the next space of awakening, which is actually just being asleep as opposed to being sedated. Now, they might want to come back to being sedated if it turns out that they're experiencing pain or suffering that they can't manage. So sometimes it is important to be put into a state of anesthesia, or to have something like a drug or a device or a distraction which allows you to cope with suffering that you can't handle. Sometimes you need to be given something that you like, or a sense of power, or feeling that you're getting what you want, in order for you to later on go on and be able to have the sense of vitality to attend to your needs or be empowered or learn the things that might be uncomfortable for you. So sometimes you do need to come back to being sedated. It's necessary. But usually only if life is incredibly traumatic for you. In hospital, you're typically sedated because you might be in a level of pain that you cannot handle, and the drugs that you would need in such a situation might be too dangerous for you in terms of the quantities that would be needed to suppress that pain. So sedation does have its purposes, but it's really something that blinds a lot of people to reality, and it's something that's only really useful if someone's experiencing great trauma and they need to have some respite with it so they can gather enough strength to get back to dealing with reality later on. Okay, so sleeping is the next stage up from being sedated. And again, if you think of someone being asleep in hospital, you know that if you just touch them or shake them, that they'll wake up. So they can respond to stimulus that will lead them to moving out of that level of consciousness to another level of consciousness. But one thing about characteristics of people who are asleep in society are that if you look at someone who is asleep, they are not aware of who else is asleep around them. They're in their own state of consciousness. They're not awake, and therefore they can't see other people around them. They can't see others that are awake. They can't see others that are asleep or even sleepwalking. So it's a characteristic of people who are asleep that they cannot see other people who are asleep. They can't recognize whether someone is speaking from a place that's conscious or whether they're speaking from a place which is habituated and is programmed. Now, it also means that they're blind to being hurt by others. And I often say that the pain or suffering that they're experiencing was brought on by themselves. So if someone hurts them, it's very well possible that they may say or not see that the other person actually hurt them. They are in their own little world, and all they see is the result of the pain, and they don't see the cause of it, the root of it. And as a consequence, because they just experience the pain kind of almost internally, they'll feel that it came from themselves, that they hurt themselves. So in situations of domestic abuse, this is often the case. A woman who's in an abusive situation may convince herself that she's brought the pain and suffering and abuse upon herself, and it really isn't the husband's fault. And this is an example of someone being asleep, and it's a tragic case of someone actually having their free will curtailed or their empowerment abused as a consequence of not really being awake to the cause of their suffering. So, as I said, people who are asleep will often blame themselves when they get hurt by others and say they kind of deserved it, almost brought it upon themselves. And often it's sleepwalkers who hurt people who are asleep. You know, sleepwalkers, if you look at sleepwalkers, they walk around, they can't even see someone who's asleep underneath them, and they'll walk all over them. And we'll come on to sleepwalkers in a moment, and you know, often when they wake up and they're told, did you realize you were hurting that person? The person says, I had no idea I was hurting that person. And of course the person who's asleep, they wouldn't have been able to see the person who's sleepwalking, walking all over them. So of course they're not going to associate their pain and suffering with that person. They'll think it's something that was self-generated on the inside. Now, the thing about someone who's asleep is that they could wake up if they were shaken by something or as a result of experiencing pain of some kind. So even someone who's being abused but is blaming themselves, it can get to a point where they experience so much pain or they see a truth that they didn't see before, and that leads them to wake up and get themselves out of that situation and no longer blame themselves or beat themselves up over what's going on. So it's possible that under their own volition and through their own free will, if they are given the opportunity to get some rest or be removed or isolated from the cause of their suffering or their pain for long enough, then they could get to see what the reality of that situation was, and they would get to actually wake up to what was going on. And they'll muster together enough motivation, enough of their willpower to break free of that situation. And under their own volition, under their own free will, they will wake up to what's going on and move into a different state of consciousness about that set of circumstances and choose to behave completely differently, and especially towards the people that might be hurting them or abusing them. Okay, so as I said, one of the features about people who are asleep is they cannot see other people who are asleep. They cannot see other people who are awake either. So that can be a problem, because if they can't see people who are awake, people who are maybe even trying to help them and trying to move them away from the people who are sleepwalking all over them, it's possible that they might give a lot of resistance to someone who's awake that's trying to help them. And it's a bit like someone being in their bed asleep and the house is burning down around them, and a fireman comes in to rescue that person and just grabs them out of their bed and rushes out of the house and puts them down on the lawn outside. Now, if you're asleep and someone suddenly wakes you up and throws you over their shoulder and then rushes you out into the external environment, you could be really upset by that. You could be really bothered. You could be really angry that someone's done that with you. But then when you look back at the burning house, then you suddenly realize, oh my God, this person saved my life. They've saved me. They allowed me to live. If I'd carried on being that way, I could have died in my sleep. So they will often resist until they wake up themselves and they see the situation that they were in, that the people who were awake were trying to alert them to. Now, people who are sleepwalking, they are individuals. If you look at them from a distance, it looks like they're awake. They're walking around, they're making a cup of tea, they may be even doing things which involve, movement of some kind that you normally would see associated with someone who's up and around and awake. But what's fascinating is when you get close to someone like that, you find that they're locked up in their own little world, that they're not really capable of having a dialogue with you, and they're not really aware of other people around them either that are in a lower state of consciousness, let alone others that are awake. And it's easy for them to bump into them or walk all over them and not even know that they're doing it. So in that sense, they can be blind to the hurt they bring to other people. And often when they do wake up and they're told that they've hurt other people, they'll deny it, and they'll say they can't acknowledge it. They didn't know what they were doing at the time. And they'll plead insanity, they'll plead ignorance or diminished responsibility or general innocence, because they just didn't have the capacity to make a view of what was really going on. Now, if you disturb someone who's sleepwalking, even if you try and touch them or shake them, then you could put them into a state of shock, because it's not something they were ready for. And it's a bit like what happens with people who are asleep, who have suddenly woken up. It can lead to them being put into a state of shock. So waking up people who are asleep or waking up people who are sleepwalking needs to be done in a very delicate way. Often it's best done in a way where you allow them to come to wakefulness through their own volition and their own free will. People who are sleepwalking are typically obsessed about something. They're going through life, there's something going on in a loop in their heads that they feel that they've got to attend to and they've got to fulfill attention to. And only when the energy to do that runs out, or they feel that that obsession has been fulfilled in terms of meeting it to a certain degree, are they going to return back to being asleep, the previous state, or they might suddenly wake up at that point. So there's usually something that's going around in a little bit of a loop inside of them that's preoccupying them with regards to something that they've got to attend to. And often when you meet people who are sleepwalking, it seems like they are off in the clouds somewhere, or that they're not quite there with you, they're not quite present, and it's because they're looping around in their own head about something else. And they're not really going to be awake to you fully until they break themselves out of that loop, whatever it is that's cycling around inside their heads. Okay, now there is another stage which is kind of halfway between sleepwalking and being awake. It's what I call sleepwaking, and it's where you genuinely are someone who's seeing occasional glimpses of the way things really are. You're genuinely getting glimpses of being awake. And the problem with that, though, is it's not able to be sustained. It seems to happen in a random way, and you'll often drift back to sleepwalking or even being asleep. Now, that does mean that there are consequences for that. It means you can be aware of the truth or aware of what reality really is because you get these glimpses, but you spend so little time there that you can't actively work with it. So it leads to the situation where you are aware of the truth of what's going on around you and within you, and maybe you have a memory of it when you come back to being in your normal state of consciousness, but you just can't reach it. You can't activate it and work with it practically. You can't walk that talk. So it does lead to another issue, which means that if you've been exposed to that truth, you can share it with other people and maybe even guide them, but you don't necessarily always walk your talk because you're not fully awake in terms of knowing exactly, practically, how you work with that reality and how you work with that truth. So there are times where you can appear to guide others and people really feel that you're awake and you know what you're talking about. But then there are other times where you just don't seem to be aligned to that truth that you're talking about. And people might consider you to be incongruent or inconsistent or lacking in integrity. And it's not that that's the case. It's just that you were given exposure to reality and the truth, but for some reason you weren't able to have the capacity to sustain your attention with it or sustain your connection with it. So you ended up slipping back to old patterns. Now, that can lead to you being often frustrated in that you know the truth. You just don't know how to act on it. You've seen it. You know what is supposed to be done, but you just can't find the means of actually doing it. You just don't know the route there. Now, this can change if you were awake long enough that you could see the route that you took back to falling back into sleepwalking or being asleep. If you have that happen to enough attention, enough awareness, you can retrace those steps, you can retrace that route, go in reverse from being sleepwalking to sleepwaking and finally back to being awake. And there have been moments where people have had epiphanies like that. Eckhart Tolle, who wrote about the power of now, and others who talk about in single moments having this full realization of exactly how to get to this higher level of consciousness. Those are examples where people have been able to fully get a clear picture of the route map that will take them back to that higher level of consciousness, and they have a memory of the path and they can take that path anytime they want to. So if you get a glimpse which is long enough of the journey that you took, then you might have enough memory of the steps that were taken for you to be able to, through conscious intent, be able to take yourself back to that full state of being awake. Okay, so awakening is obviously the stage this is mostly focused on in terms of my discussion today. Now, if you look at someone who's awake in normal life, everyday life, if you're at a party, how do you know the person that's in the party with you is actually awake, or somebody else who you've not met yet? Well, if you see someone that you recognize in a party, you might shout out to them or wave to them, and if they are awake, then they're obviously gonna, if they see you, they're gonna wave back to you, or they might make a movement over towards you and start a dialogue with you. All right. Now, it might be that the person you're looking at is actually sleepwalking and not really awake, in which case you'll wave to them, but they won't wave back, or you'll talk to them, start a dialogue with them, but they don't seem to talk back to you. They seem to be in their own little world and talking about their own stuff, but never seem to acknowledge anything you're saying. So that's an example of someone who looks like they're awake, but actually they're in a state of sleepwalking or maybe even sleepwaking. So someone who's genuinely awake will acknowledge you. They probably look at you eye to eye. That's often a key sign that the person is awake enough to realize your existence in the same space as them. Someone who's sleepwalking will not be able to hold their gaze eye to eye. It's a pattern that you'll often see, and it's a classic one because I find I get a different energetic experience of people who I can look at eye to eye and hold that gaze, not for the sake of some competition, but because you're choosing to be fully present with that person. And that's a key characteristic of people who are awake. They're capable of being fully present with each other and literally engage each other eye to eye. In the movie Avatar, one of the characters says that they see the other characters say, "I see you." And they don't mean I visually see you. They mean they can see the other person in terms of their true, authentic self. And they're talking about a point of view which is an awakened point of view. So it's a characteristic of people that are awake that they will acknowledge other people who are awake, and they will be able to interact with them in a two-way fashion rather than just a one-way fashion. Now, they can also see reality, but it doesn't necessarily mean they can actually act on it. So, for example, if you're in bed and you're asleep and you wake up, it doesn't mean that you're actually active and you're up and walking around, you're going to the loo, you're feeding yourself and being able to go out into the garden. It's the same sort of principle here. Just because you're awake, it doesn't mean you can do anything with what you are awake to. So it might be that if you're kind of metaphorically bedridden, you need other people to bring things to you in order for you to be nurtured or to be able to be looked after. So just because you're awake, it doesn't mean that you're active, which is what the next space is that we're going to talk about. People who often come into a state of awakening, they may not find what they are awakened to be pleasant. It might be that they feel that they're still tired and they haven't recovered enough energy and that they want to go back to sleep and sleep a little bit longer. Maybe what they're experiencing was too taxing or too painful, and they feel they just want to numb it out and go back to sleep and get a bit more energy. So that's a characteristic that does happen. If you watch the Matrix movies, in the very first movie, there's a character who wants to be returned to a state of being asleep and not fully conscious, and he makes a deal with the agents that control reality for him to be put to a reality where he is numb to the way things really are. So some people choose to go back to sleep because the reality that they're in is something that they can't handle, or it just doesn't, float their boat for some reason. People who are awake can obviously talk with other people who are awake, and they can also explore things together. They can have a conversation and talk about something in a way where they can discover things beyond what they know as individuals. So this is another feature of people who are awake. They can talk at a level where they can discover new things together. People who are awake also are very clear about what they need to learn, how they need to learn, and who they need to learn those things with. And it's through this process of recognizing what they need to learn, how they need to learn, who they need to learn with, that they actually discover why they are having the life that they are and why they're trying to fulfill a purpose that they have awareness of. It might actually even lead to them discovering what their purpose is if they didn't know what it was before. Okay, so that was about being awake. The other thing I should say about being awake before we go into activation is that there are people who are awake who themselves are waking up to a higher level of consciousness, and they don't want to be disturbed while they're moving to that higher level of consciousness. There are masters in this world who are doing work at higher levels, and they are doing things beyond their body. And if you approach these individuals and you ask for advice on how to look after yourself in your world, in your normal waking state, they won't like it. They'll get upset that you're interfering with their higher level of consciousness and the work that they're trying to do in that area. And often people who are already awake might warn you against people like that. They'll say, look, that person's doing really important work, don't disturb them, because they don't want to be having to deal with the trivial issues of your awakening when they're dealing with awakening issues that are to do with the masses or greater collected forms of consciousness. So there are some people who are gurus, if you like, in this world. They do know everything, and they have a higher level of consciousness than you, a more extended form of consciousness than you. But when you approach them and ask them for answers, they can get very ratty, they can get very annoyed with you, and may even not necessarily appear to be compassionate with you. And it's not because they are, being snooty or elitist or anything. They've got other things to do which are more important than looking after your awakening. So it's really important not to look at those individuals as being bad or egotistical or something like that. They may just be having to handle something that's far more important than your individual awakening. So don't be too upset if you do meet people who supposedly know everything and won't make the time to help you. It's probably because they are either working on themselves and their own challenges at their own level of wakefulness, or they're working on behalf of a greater collective of people and their consciousness and helping that to actually evolve. So you've got to give them space to be able to do that work, because they're not typically just doing it for themselves. They're doing it for a greater community which happens to include you as well. Okay, so as I said, once you're awake, it's like being awake in a house. You want to get up out of bed, you want to look after yourself, feed yourself, and get around. And you want to also liaise with the people in that house and that space or that consciousness that you're sharing with other people. It might be your family, it might be your friends, it might be your soul family, people who you're not directly related to genetically, but you're related to for spiritual reasons, karmic reasons, or other purposes, people that you might be working with in your a team at work or a department, for example. Now, when you are awake and you can see other people who are awake, they're the only people that you can do anything with. But also, if you see something that you want to change, for example, you want to go and get yourself a glass of water and not wait for somebody else to get you it, you can get up and do it yourself. You have the ability to actually act on your own intentions and fulfill them and follow through on them. So you will find that you're a bit more empowered than you were when you were just awake. You can also move to different views of the world, different angles of the world in terms of your consciousness, beyond what it might have been that actually brought you into being awake. So sometimes a person can wake up in their lives when they're in one sphere of their life, maybe at work or maybe at home, or maybe because they went to another holiday somewhere special. But then that awakening is something that spreads to other parts of their life, and they start shifting their perspectives in other parts of their life too. So it's possible to move into different conscious perspectives beyond the one that you actually woke up with. You can also act beyond your own interests. If you're up and around, you can help other people that are also up and around, and maybe you can work together with them to, help one another, help feed one another, help inform one another, help to actually explore and understand things together. And most of the time it is really for not just mutual survival, but also for mutual evolution as well. Now, it does lead you to actually ultimately being able to look after yourself fully. You're fully empowered to support yourself, to create your own challenges to help you to grow, but also to think through things and process things, reflect on things effectively, and know what kind of support you need to get for yourself, and know also when it's time to stretch yourself beyond your comfort zone into something that's going to give you more capability to handle the things that you're about to move into. Okay, so this is the kind of person, when you look at them, they would be considered to be of sound mind and body, and that they are also, in traditional sense, could be considered to be solvent, in that they can look after themselves financially in terms of their own welfare and maybe even their loved ones. It's possible that they may even be doing stuff beyond their family in their community. And it's that last stage about doing things beyond yourself with other people who are awake, beyond the people that are connected directly into you, that exists in other communities of consciousness that you might want to link into. That final stage is what I call affiliation. This is where you are able to work with other people and bring about change in your life and theirs and in a wider community. Now, it's only people who are awake that can actually make plans. people who are asleep or sleepwalking, they can't gather around a table and start creating a strategy or a plan to make a change for themselves or for the world. It's only people that are awake, that at the minimum level are awake, can begin to make plans. But lots of people who are asleep or awake in their beds, they're not necessarily going to be able to get up and do anything. They would need to at least be activated, in order for them to actually make a difference beyond themselves out there in the world, which is why if changes are going to be brought about in the wider community, it needs to happen with people who are not only awake but are active, up and around and doing things practically, and are not just philosophizing about change. They are actually generating experience of it and bringing about it for themselves. They typically are not going to work with low levels of consciousness. Like, they're not going to be playing games or in a state of deception or denial. They won't have time for that. If they're going to make plans, they're going to make plans with reality and with higher levels of consciousness. That's what they're going to work with. Anybody who's awake is not going to work with someone who's asleep. They're going to work with other people who are awake and at least the same level of consciousness as them. And that's typically a higher level of consciousness or enriched level of consciousness. When they've hung around other people long enough and in their community for long enough, they'll probably discover that there's a kind of gap somewhere which they could go into and help other people. They could find their own unique purpose in that awakened community, and they could find their own true place in that community. So that can only happen, of course, if they get up out of bed, out of their house perhaps, and go out into the world. It can't all be just done from their bed. So it's important for someone who's awake and activated, if they really want to find their true place in the world, they're going to have to go out into a wider community of awakened people and find them and see what it is that they could offer that's going to be of value and that will empower that community and make a difference in the world. So that's probably the most important bit, that when you are in a state of affiliation with other people, you are really collaborating with them. You're empowered enough to look after your own interests, but you're also starting to collaborate with others for a greater good. Now, all of those steps that I've mentioned to you, they're not really a sequence, they're a cycle. And I've shown the picture here of that cycle. You can see it starts with sedation and goes on to sleeping, sleepwalking, waking, awakening, activation, affiliation. But you can see it actually goes back to sedation. You might think, well, surely that's not right. Well, actually, it is. If you think about what animals do when they hibernate, that's really what this is indicating here. When you go through a certain cycle of awakening, at the end of it, you've got to take a rest. You've got to take some time out for recuperation, reflection, and processing before you activate yourself to a higher level of consciousness. So actually, after every cycle of awakening, you have to go through a kind of metamorphosis in a similar way to where a caterpillar goes into a chrysalis. And while they're in that state, then you'll find that processing can take place, a reorganization internally can take place, and things can reform into what they need to in order for them to move into a higher way of being. They can allow the caterpillar to change its form and function to that of a butterfly. So sedation is a bit like hibernation. It's not something that's strictly meant to be something that numbs you. Sometimes, as I said, it's necessary in order for you to have the capability of transforming yourself without interference from external events. You need to be incubated, you need to be put into a womb in order to transform to a higher form or a higher way of functioning in the world. Now, having said that, the last stage here, affiliation, is something I highlighted was linked to collaboration. So once you've gone through a number of awakening cycles, you're probably going to come to a point where you will have a deeper connection with yourself, maybe even a deeper connection with other people. And that will lead you to start having conversations that you may never have had before, a higher level of consciousness with yourself and other people. it may even lead you to becoming someone who is able to cooperate with themselves more effectively, as well as cooperate with other people. And you'll find that you can make more of a difference or a contribution to your own life as well as other people's. You can do things rather in a short-term transactional way. You can actually start committing to doing things for the long term, things that require more trust and more sustainability and stability. Now, if you can do that, then you can probably enter into a greater state of collaboration with yourself and also be able to collaborate with others more effectively. And when you're in this greater state of collaboration, it's then that you can create bigger things in the world rather than just small things. And those bigger things can then be communicated out to a larger audience, a larger number of connections beyond the ones that you have currently. And if you get stuck at any stage and you find yourself going backwards, it's probably because there are interests that are not being respected or understood or taken care of, whether it's your own self-interest or whether it's the interests of others. Typically, when you go backwards in the collaboration cycle at any stage, you're entering into a state of competition. So competition is really important because it ensures that people's interests are looked after and their intentions in a respectful and responsible way. You don't want to be in a state of competition all the time, otherwise you never move forward and end up being able to collaborate with yourself more effectively or others. Now, the collaboration cycle is something I'm going to go into a lot more detail about tomorrow when we have a separate webinar specifically for that. And we'll look at what happens when people wake up and they move into a state of connection where they want to do something bigger in the world beyond themselves, and or maybe just even do something bigger with themselves, with what they already have. They want the different parts of their life to actually collaborate with each other and connect up and start supporting each other. That's often how it starts. You learn to collaborate with yourself, and then ultimately you extend that out to collaborating with others in order to make a difference and bring about empowerment amongst the community that you're a part of. So we'll look a bit more closely at the collaboration cycle tomorrow. But I want to finish today just by summing up what we've been talking about so far about the awakening cycle. And if you look at the diagram that's up on the screen at the moment, we started off by saying that when you're in a state of sedation, you're normally attached to various things like drugs and devices, distractions, anesthesia, or you have addictions. And sometimes you need to come back to this state because you need to recuperate, because life can be too taxing and you need to gather enough energy for you to move to the next stage. So when you are able to remove yourself from devices in your life and you come to a place of stillness, then you'll find that under your own volition you'll naturally wake up, or you'll begin to show symptoms of waking up. And after you've woken up, the next thing to do is activate your spiritual muscles and get up and start doing things with what you are awake to. And when you can do that in conjunction with other people or through affiliation with other people, then you can start collaborating with them to make a bigger difference in the world. But it's important that the end of each of these cycles of awakening, you always take time to rest and recuperate and regenerate your resources and reconnect to your own source of motivation and passion and vitality. If you don't do that, then in a very short time you get run down and burnt out, and you won't be able to do anything with the awakened state that you've actually got, and that can be really, really frustrating. So that's an overview of the awakening cycle. I've not really gone into detail about the practical aspects of movement between these stages, but that's really what tomorrow's webinar is about. It's about how does this work in practice? How can I take what I've been awakened to and practically go about making a difference in my life, and also in the process empower others, and together build a more empowered, awake and purposeful world. So that's what we'll actually have a look at tomorrow when we look at the collaboration cycle. Okay, for now though, what we're going to do is bring the presentation to a close by just connecting in with people again that are listening in and just getting some feedback about how they found things so far in terms of the presentation that's been given. Okay, so let's have a look at who's here, and let's have a chat with some of those people. Let's see who's in the audience. Okay. Let's ask Peter what he thinks. Peter, can you hear us? Peter Bencour? No, he's not there. Okay, go back to Mercedes. Can you hear us, Mercedes? No, they're not there either. Okay, Mariela.
Hi.
Hey, Mariela.
I can hear you, right?
Ah, good, there's someone there.
I'm still awake. I'm still awake.
Good. How have you found what's been said so far?
Very interesting, but I feel that it's like you're going in circles, always coming back to the same kind of mode for a reason, as you said, because one cannot stay in those highly awakened states all the time, because it's only like you're literally leaping from one dimension to another, but you're still living in this dimension, so you have to come back. And also because you're living a normal life and there are things that you need to do, you need to stay in those other states.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about, if we are being attached to a gadget, like I'm being attached to a computer right now, whether I'm actually in a sedation mode or not.
Well, devices are needed to a certain degree, but the important thing is not to be attached to them.
Right, okay.
So, I can use my phone, but it's not surgically attached to my hand. But if I use it too much, and it's actually taking me away from reality, from directly experiencing reality, and I keep having to use my phone or my computer or TV or a newspaper or a magazine as a surrogate, then that's an example of sedated behavior.
I think it's very much true because today kids especially are attached to their gadgets so much, and they sort of live their lives on their own almost, because all they are connecting to is someone on a Facebook or a Twitter, and they think they've got masses of friends, but they forget to live.
Yeah, anything which takes you away from direct experience of reality is a form of sedation. And sometimes you need information and you need to get it through certain devices. But if it's serving the purpose of waking you up, that's great. But if you use those things too much and rely on them too much to the point where they end up being a distraction or an addiction, then obviously you're not waking up. You're actually being locked in a loop where you are, somehow being shielded from the way things really are, the truth, and what's really authentic that you're meant to be connecting to. Yeah?
So true. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, one of the things I just want to say, thanks a lot, Marietta, is that this video that we're presenting today, this webinar, is actually being recorded. So I'll put a link up tomorrow that links up to YouTube where people can watch it. And you'll be able to go over it if there's some things that you feel you want to hear again and maybe get a refresher on. I'm just going to take 2 or 3 more comments and then we'll close for today. Go back to some of the people that we spoke to earlier. Let's start with Deborah. Deborah, are you there?
I am here, Jazz, yeah.
Great.
I just started typing comments box actually, just to say that it's been really useful going through that. And I can certainly recognise, where I am and where I've been and where I'm going in the awakening cycle. That's been extraordinarily useful.
Well, you probably find that there's not one place that you're necessarily in. I've said in a Facebook post today that typically someone's centered on one of these stages, but they tend to drift either side. So, for example, someone who is awakened might drift into sleepwalking, but equally they might drift into a more activated mode. And similarly, with someone who's sleeping, they might drift into sedation or they might drift into sleepwalking, but they tend to, on average, hang around the sleeping stage. So they have their own range of movement with regards to their consciousness, and it's pretty true for anybody, whatever stage they're at. They tend not to be just at that single stage. It's very rare that you see someone who's locked in a single stage, and they don't have the ability to reach out into the neighbouring stages for either for rest or recuperation, or for extended challenge and growth when they move into a first stage that's further along. So in what you've seen, do you know people that you see people that you know that are, and you think, oh, I know that person's at this stage, they're sleeping, they're sedating, or they're activated?
Yeah, and as you're going through it, I could recognise different people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and and myself as well.
Right.
What's also interesting as well is I find that when I'm drawn to go travelling, it's normally because I need some time out to go back into that state of awakening to do some more work on myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then when I come back, I'm like activated, and then it's like going out there and doing the affiliation.
Yeah. That's what I meant about spaces rather than levels. These are different spaces that you move through. It's more like a landscape that you're moving around in. And sometimes you want to be in a certain part of the landscape, and sometimes you want to be in another part of the landscape, depending on what your needs and what your purpose actually is. So it's important to not look at this as being a linear thing. All these things do have relationships to each other, and it's important to, like I said, look at them more as a cycle and a landscape rather than a series of steps that you're meant to take. Yeah?
Yeah, one question for you. You know, like it cycles from affiliation through to sedation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Could you give us an example of when that might happen?
Well, affiliation is where you're with a bunch of other people that are awake at least to the same level as you are. Okay. And you actually then go out to a different community of people who are not awake, and they might be sedated, for example. That's an example of where an awakened community might then need to link with a wider community which is not awake and is in a state of sedation. But equally, someone who's gone through a process of awakening, or a community that's gone through an awakening, it might need to rest and recuperate itself. So often in a lot of tribal cultures, you'll see this happen through spiritual ceremonies or religious ceremonies. There will come a certain time of the year where everybody celebrates, or everybody goes to a place of hibernation. And in the olden days, tribal cultures, that's what they used to do. If you look at the Native American Indians, they wouldn't tend to hang around just in one place. They would often have a winter ground for them to go and live in. There would be a summer ground where the hunting was more plentiful, for example. So they would change the space they're in all the time, and especially around winter, when they need to go and find somewhere warm where they could hole up for the winter period and survive despite the severe external weather that there might be. And this is even necessary on a daily basis. At the end of each day, you might have learnt certain things, and you need to take time to process them and join the dots. So it's possible this can happen at an individual level with your own consciousness, where you join together things like your own perspectives that you are waking up to, and you just let some time for them to acclimatize and become more embedded and ingrained within you. In a similar way, within the community, if you have a group of people who have all woken up together, that they're going to want sooner or later to take some rest from the challenges that they've been exposed to and the truths that they've been exposed to, and take time to process things. And an example of that is if there's been a tragedy of some kind. In the news recently, Andy Murray was talking about the tragedy he experienced in Dunblane when lots of children were killed in his hometown. And that town has had to go through a trauma and wake up to the reality of their suffering. And at the end of it, through affiliation, they, over time, were able to become a bit more settled with what had actually happened, and gather enough energy when they were given space to do so for them to cope with the consequences of what actually happened. So that's an example of where sedation in this way is really about rest and recuperation. It's about regeneration, it's about hibernation, and it's about resourcing yourself in readiness for the next thing that you are going to have to do to grow or to advance yourself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Thank you for that.
Okay, thanks, Deborah. I'm just going to take 2 more comments and then we're going to close up for today. What we'll do is just go back to Mercedes. Are you there? Can you hear us now? No, she's gone. Okay, we'll try somebody else. Someone who hasn't. Yeah, Hazel looks like she's alive. Are you alive, Hazel?
It says unmuted. I love it. Yeah, I'm here. Unmuted. I feel very unmuted. Yeah, just thinking about some of those comments and things, and I think a couple of things, and one is within the cycle that it not to place, and I'm not saying that you're saying that or anybody else is, but not to place one above another or importance, because I think we often are in, as you said as well, we're in many stages or places at one time. However, when we become, I feel that when we become present to doing what we're doing, or what we need to focus on, whether that's inward introspection or communicating with people, doing whatever we're doing, it's almost as if we're just zoned in there. But it doesn't mean that there's not other things going on at the same time, or that we're not working within those stages, but maybe we're more focused in one area. And so perhaps being present, just a thought, but perhaps being present to where you are makes you feel like you're in one area at one time, and that's not necessarily such a bad thing, I guess, if we're actually present to where we are.
Well, there's 2 things I want to share today before closing, and it relates to how do people move from one stage to the next, but also it also links into something else, which is to do with when you're awake. You might remember what you did the day before when you were awake, and if you get skills, for example, that you develop when you go to sleep and when you wake up, you don't forget those skills. They're in there, in you somewhere, and it's just simply a matter of recalling your memory of them and being able to use them. And it's a very similar sort of thing with awakening to your own potential. You need to recognize that when someone talks about using visualization, for example, to improve their skills or improve their knowledge, the reality is that you know all this stuff already. You have access to all this knowledge already. It's not a matter of visualizing, it's a matter of remembering that you know this and getting present and still enough for you to connect into the memory of this knowledge. Now, this means that when you move from one stage to the next and you're trying to expand your consciousness or extend it, there's nothing really to learn. There's just things that you've got to remember. And if everything's just about remembering something, then you have to get really present. You have to get really still. And then when there's not too much crowding your mind, then that memory that you're seeking of that potential that you have will come to the surface of your awareness, and it will become something you can activate and actually work with. And some people have said, well, that's an important component of evolving through this space. And as I said, it is a space. It's not levels. It's more like a matrix. It's more like a landscape that you're moving through, and different parts of the landscape have different kind of qualities when you move from one part of the landscape to another. And you want to know your own land. You want to know your own inner nation. And if you want to do that, you have to get familiar with all the different parts of the landscape and the different parts of your own inner territory. But one of the things I discovered was that part of moving from one state to another is to do with humility and nobility. For example, if you are moving to an awakened state after you've been asleep, then it's similar to making a jump of some kind. If you want to jump from a standing position, you can push up towards your toes, but you won't jump up very high. But if you bend your knees and bend your ankles and lower yourself down a little bit, then those various pivots that you've got in your body's architecture can kind of spring load your muscles, and it can all be released and lead you to be able to jump much higher. But what you're actually doing there, physically lowering yourself and then jumping up to a higher place, metaphorically, that's what you need to do with your life. It means there are times where you need to be humble, where you need to lower your position of consciousness so that you can gather enough energy to leap to a more noble state of mind, a higher state of mind, a higher position, a higher consciousness than the one that you're actually located in. So actually the whole process of awakening is this kind of process of entering into humility to enough of a degree that you can leap up to a higher state of nobility. So you're constantly cycling between humility and nobility, and that's what moves you from one state of wakefulness or consciousness to other spaces. So as I said, it's not really about climbing to the highest possible level. It's about moving into the space that serves your purpose today. And it might be that tomorrow you need to be in the same space. But generally in life, if you are in the right space at the right time, then you will find that your purpose is going to get honored, you'll be empowered, and you also get to make a difference in the world. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's a very succinct answer.
Oh, sorry. I suddenly looked and I couldn't see, and I wasn't sure if I was muted or not.
No, you're still on. I was just saying, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I like the bit about moving into the space that serves your purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So then it's not a right or a wrong or a this or a that. There's no judgment around it.
No.
It doesn't even come into it. You're just in the space you need to be in at that time.
That's right. And real awakening is about that, you know. If a caterpillar's on the verge of coming out of chrysalis and becoming a butterfly, all right, it shouldn't try and reverse itself and go into eating leaves when it now needs to focus on drinking nectar. You know, it needs to look at the stage it's at and see what's the appropriate thing for the stage or space I'm in. You know, and there are lots of butterflies in this world, trust me, who still eat like caterpillars and they move like caterpillars. They're stuck in one place, and you know, they're not in a state of symbiosis, which is often the case between people who are, you know, in the earlier parts of the cycle in certain spaces like sedation, sleeping and sleepwalking. They tend to rely on other people feeding them and nurturing them, but when they get into the higher stages, it's like the butterfly and the caterpillar. In the lower stages, the caterpillar is eating the thing that is its home, the leaf that it's actually on, you know, and it's doing it in a destructive way and not giving anything in return. You know, it's very parasitic almost in that sense. But a butterfly is completely the opposite. You know, it doesn't eat its host. It actually, you know, drinks the nectar, but in exchange, it takes the pollen of the flower and allows for that flower to continue to exist by the way that it goes on and pollinates, you know, other plants and flowers. So it's very symbiotic in that sense. So awakening is like that. There are going to be times in your life where you need to look after yourself, and sometimes that can even lead to destructive behaviors. But providing it's sustainable, then it's not really a problem. If you're not eating the leaves at a rate where they can't reproduce and regenerate themselves, for example. But there are going to be times when, if you are not exercising butterfly behavior and pollinating the plants that you're actually on, then there could come a time when there are no leaves to eat for the caterpillars, you know. And that's an example of, you know, there being no sustainability in that awakening process. And that's really critical, because some people are really hungry for being awakened, and they move through it so fast, they do it in a way which is not sustainable. And they find themselves in an awakened state, but they can't sustain it because the resources are not around. They weren't prepared in a way where those resources can be regenerated. So some people go through what might be considered a single cycle of awakening, and instead of ending up in a place where they can rest and recuperate, they actually die. You know, there's nothing left for them to continue to sustain themselves at that level of awakening. And often people get disillusioned with spirituality, or they get disillusioned with the truth that they've discovered, and they feel disempowered and disenchanted. So there is a side to this which is something that can lead to unnecessary suffering. And of course the Buddhists and the Indian yogis and a lot of other people, they place heavy emphasis on not putting yourself into a situation where you're experiencing unnecessary suffering. Now, there are some things which are uncomfortable and that some people might consider to be suffering, but in reality they're just challenging. And if you can get through them, you'll learn a lot, you'll develop, and you'll grow. But what you don't want to do is put yourself into a situation where you're working with your development, your growth, your awakening, your resources in a way which is not sustainable and is not in a kind of operation which is symbiotic with the environment that you're actually in. Otherwise, the consequence will be you'll come to a certain point of development and the fuels run out, and you'll survive a certain amount of time at that level of consciousness, and then you'll just slip back naturally to lower levels or different spaces of consciousness, I should say. And that's a perfectly natural thing. And it might be that when the environment has recovered itself and regenerated itself, then you can go back to that other space of wakefulness. But it's very much like the environment and ecology. If things are not managed in a natural, sustainable way, then they don't last. They become extinct. And you can be the brightest penny in the world one moment and the source of a lot of wisdom for a lot of people, and in another year you could be someone who's completely derelict and not able to help anybody, even yourself. And I know these things because I've lived through them. I've actually had those kind of experiences, so I'm conscious that it's not all a bed of roses. If you don't manage it effectively, you can get yourself into sticky situations where you're not of any help to yourself, let alone anybody else.
But I can't remember who says it, but enlightenment isn't really for the faint-hearted. It's not a sort of just a bit of a joke and that we'll all be high and everybody's excited and isn't it cool. It's actually quite hard work at times, and it's not always pleasant. It's not always doesn't always feel easy. And I think a lot of people think that road's going to be quite cool, and then the Kundalini awakes and other things, and then they blow the circuits, and it's similar to what you're saying. And then they have a crash and burn and don't, oh, that wasn't pleasant. I don't think I want to play that game.
Well, the problem with people who are faint-hearted when they go through this process is that they become taint-hearted. They go from faint-hearted to taint-hearted. Their hearts are tainted. They are disillusioned, and they become skeptical of what they thought once would save them. And it's not that it's something that's failed them. It's that they failed themselves by not being respectful and responsible about that awakening process, and as a result it didn't last, it wasn't sustainable, and it didn't get to a point where it even was able to be extended out to helping other people. And there's a lot of people I know who got to that stage where they thought they were about to make a difference to the world, and that their process was cut short, and they live a life of resentment as a consequence of that, and they're not going to recover from that until they work with awakening in a sustainable way. And that usually means including time for them to have rest, including time for them where they're not just consuming learning and consuming the process of empowerment on an ongoing ferocious rate of work. There's got to be time for rest and processing. If they don't do that, as you said, they're going to burn out, and then they're only going to end up in a state of regret with it all, and may even not want to continue because they become just so disenchanted by it all. So when it gets done right, and this cycle and all of its spaces are respected and in a responsible way managed, it's a bit like farming, where if you just keep growing the same crop in the same field all the time, then eventually the nutrients run out and that crop can't effectively be grown in that area anymore. Sometimes you have to move it around. You have to go into other spaces and grow it there, and you need to change things around a little bit. And that variety ensures that the soil stays vitalized and continues to allow for growth. And you can't work the soil all the time. You need to give it rest. And then it can provide, a new crop in the new season. And it's the same thing with awakening. You can have a crop of enlightenment, but then you have to look at growing something else, something different perhaps, in that same field of consciousness, and occasionally giving that field of awareness and consciousness a rest so that it can recover enough vitality for it to be able to grow another crop of awareness, another shift in awakening. That's what's really important. And if you can do that in a sustainable way and not try and accelerate it in a unsafe way, then you can use that field for nurturing yourself for an awful long time. Typically what some people do is, metaphorically, they bring in pesticides, they bring in fertilizers, and unfortunately the soil and the plants after a while get acclimatized to that, and the field in its own standing can't support growth of any kind. It always has to require artificial input in order for it to be able to do anything. And this is often what happens when people start turning to devices, as I said earlier, and drugs, and they start to turn into artificial means of growing. And it can lead to a kind of sedation which is not helpful, lends itself to awakening, but actually gets themselves into a deeper state of being numb and blind and unaware and disempowered. So it's really important that you farm your own enlightenment in a natural, sustainable way, and you do it in an environmentally friendly way too. Otherwise, you end up with climate change, which is going to really raise the sea levels of your consciousness in a way which is going to overwhelm you and flood you. So on that point, I'm going to finish. Thanks very much, Hazel, for that comment. And I'd like to thank everybody else that's joined us today. And as a parting comment, what I'd like to just say is that the whole space of awakening is something that you need to look after. You can't just hang around in one part of it and allow the rest of the landscape to fall apart. The whole thing is something that you need to approach like some people approach permaculture. Each part has a part to play in your awakening and also in your empowerment, as well as your ability to make a difference beyond yourself to the world. And providing you are in the right space at the right time, then you will find that the landscape of your consciousness is something that's very fertile. It's full of life, it's full of beauty, and it's something that you absolutely adore being in, and it's something that other people will want to come and be in too. So it's important to work with your awakening in that kind of way, in that sustainable way, because if you can, then you'll have vitality, you'll have life for generations of consciousness within yourself, but also generations in terms of your physical life, your family, your community, your country, your culture, even your business and your customers. It can last in a way which continues to evolve consciousness itself within you, between you and other people, and for humanity as a whole. And that's where I'd ultimately like myself to be spending time, at that level of affiliation where people are awake, are working together to wake themselves up to higher levels in a sustainable way, and in the process make the world a more beautiful place, and to be able to sustain that beauty in a graceful way. So thanks everybody for tuning in today. I'm going to stop the recording now, and I'll be happy to receive any further comments through the Facebook page, and I look forward to those of you who want to see the next part of this, the collaboration cycle, the practical aspects of this, being covered tomorrow evening at the same time. So if you haven't registered for that, please do so. The link for registration is on the Facebook page for this event. If you have not got that and you came through this through some other route, then you're welcome to just send me a message via my website, and you'll be able to actually send a contact message through that. My website is energydiamond.com, and you'll be able to see that at the final screen here. And if you go to the contact page there, you'll be able to send a message from there to me, and I'll be able to send you a link for the webinar tomorrow. So thanks again for everybody who's attended and all your comments and all your feedback. I look forward to getting your additional feedback through Facebook, and also to seeing you in the second part of this tomorrow evening for the collaboration cycle. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.